So hello, I'm Donna Dunlap of Enterprise Community Partners. On behalf of HUD, I'd like to welcome you to this RAD Relocation Training webinar. Just a few logistics before we get started. First, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. Second, there's a lot of information to be covered in today's training, and we want to be sure to get to it all. To that end, we will not be taking questions during the webinar, but we encourage you to email any questions you may have to rad@hud.gov. Again, I'll repeat that. You might want to jot it down, rad@hud.gov for all your questions. If you experience any technical difficulties during the session, please send a message through the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try to get it resolved for you. Excuse me one second. There we go. And with that, now I'm going to turn this over to Claude Dixon of HUD, who will be introducing some comments from HUD leadership. Claude?
Thank you. My name is Claude Dixon. I'm a senior advisor with the Office of RECAP. This training is a joint presentation of the Office of Community Planning and Development, the Office of Public and Indian Housing, and the Office of Recapitalization. You will be hearing from several people in terms of the case studies, Brian O'Neill, Virginia Flores, and myself, but most of the presentation will be given by Tom Davis, Senior Vice President for RECAP Real Estate Advisors. And at this time, I'd like to invite Jeff Little, the Deputy Director for the Office of Recapitalization, to give some introductory remarks.
Great. Thanks, Claude. And I'll be really quick. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate the big crowd that's joined the call today. We're certainly hoping that it's going to be a great discussion and a lot of good information for you guys. The relocation process as a part of the RAD transactions is obviously very, very critical, and it's something we want to make sure that we're providing you with all the information you need to successfully manage your responsibilities and the actions that need to be taken for relocation. Certainly, it is a part of the RAD process that can cause a lot of problems and delays, and so the best thing we can do is to get all the information out there and equip you guys to successfully manage it. The team's been working hard on pulling together what I think is a really fantastic presentation. I think you're going to get really good information today. But afterwards, by all means, continue to follow up with us. Let us know if you think that there are things that are still needed, pieces of information, feedback that we need to get out there, and we'll continue to work with you in the months and years to come to successfully get relocation addressed appropriately in the RAD process. But thanks again for joining us, and on with the show.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And Tom, take it from the top.
Great. Thank you very much. And welcome, everyone. I just wanted to start by giving folks a little bit of a preview of what we're hoping to cover today, and then we'll dive right in. We're going to try to give an overview of a lot of information. There are resources that will be listed on a slide at the end, and a lot of good reference places that you can all reach through the internet to get the documents and references that I mentioned or that others mentioned through the course of this webinar. The overall agenda that we're doing here is we're going to provide a little bit of an overview of the relocation rules. This webinar is entirely focused on the first component of RAD, the public housing conversion component. And we will then sort of follow through the sequence of a typical RAD conversion transaction and some of the pieces that come up at different points in time during that process. Overall, there are some themes that I think you'll notice as we're talking. The first is that relocation is a very facts-based analysis, so we're providing you some guidance on what the requirements are and what some of the best practices are, but you will ultimately be doing facts analysis on how that applies to your situation. The second key theme that you'll identify is that planning for relocation is key, and there are some critically important RAD overlay rules that are in addition to the Uniform Relocation Act requirements that you're familiar with, relating to a right of return for residents, a prohibition on permanent involuntary relocation, and a distinction between permanent and temporary relocation. And then the other pieces that you'll hear through the webinar are the emphasis on communication and timing of the right events and good notice to residents, and ultimately that the residents are treated fairly and are assured decent, safe, and sanitary housing throughout. So we'll be revisiting some of those themes, but on this next sort of overview slide, I wanted to highlight what some of the spirit of the rules are behind the requirements and guidance that we'll be talking about. And fundamentally, the relocation picture in the RAD context is about resident consultation, keeping residents informed of the potential plans for their community, ensuring that they understand how those potential plans impact their tenancy, and then ensuring that the right of return and fair treatment that is applied consistently and equitably are sort of underlying principles. And so it's useful to, at least when I'm thinking through the relocation issues, I find it helpful to keep those spirit of the rules principles in mind throughout. The key RAD overlay, and you'll hear me say this over and over again through the course of the webinar, because there have been already examples of folks not fully grasping or implementing these takeaways, is the right of return, that residents hold a right of return, and the transaction needs to be designed so that they can exercise it. Related to that is that there is no rescreening of current residents. The third sort of big takeaway, actually the second on this slide, is that moving does not happen prior to closing of the RAD conversion, and I'll be revisiting all of these things in a little more detail. And then finally, that there is no permanent involuntary relocation. So those are, if you get nothing else from this webinar, remember those key pieces, but we're going to try to give you a whole lot more information over the next 2 hours in order to flesh out some of the details on how it really can get applied. So starting with the overview program by program, there are several different statutory and regulatory frameworks that apply to a RAD public housing transaction. Four in particular that I want to highlight on this slide. The first is the RAD program notice and the RAD relocation notice. The RAD relocation notice, if you're not familiar with it, is at it's H2014-09 and PIH 2014-17. I'm not going to give you a lot of citations through the course of the webinar because there is a list of resources at the end, and I believe that HUD will be making all of making the webinar PowerPoint available to you on the website after. But the RAD relocation notice has a lot of detail. The second piece to bear in mind is the Uniform Relocation Act. That it applies certainly in RAD cases. It also can apply independently, so it's worth being aware of that. The RAD relocation notice is an attempt to blend the URA with the RAD requirements, but URA is also a standalone requirement. A third standalone requirement is if you are bringing CDBG or home funds into a RAD conversion transaction, Section 104D will apply, and I'll describe what that is a little later. And finally, all of this work is in the context of needing to comply with fair housing and civil rights laws. And sometimes that is an obvious application, and sometimes it's a little less obvious, but it is important to think through the fair housing implications. As an example, is the relocation option that you are offering to the residents one that would sort of steer residents into an area of minority concentration, in which case that's a flag for fair housing concerns, or if even if relocation is not planned, is the route to someone's unit that was accessible being disrupted by the construction work, which would trigger fair housing or civil rights laws. So some of the fair housing and civil rights issues are ones that may not be first that come to mind, but they should be very present in your thinking. So there are these 4 statutory frameworks that are all part of the RAD relocation picture. And the first of them on the list is of course, the RAD relocation basics. These are the essentials that are the overlay that you may not be as familiar with. The right of return with an obligation to redesign the transaction in order to ensure that the residents can exercise that, and a prohibition on permanent involuntary relocation. The resident can choose permanent relocation, but that's a sensitive area, and you really need to make sure that the resident's choice is fully informed and documented, and if that is something that is in the discussion with residents at all. The second of the 4 regulatory and statutory frameworks is, of course, the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisitions Policies Act. A bit of a handful. It's the URA in sort of common HUD parlance, as many of you know. And its core framework is to ensure that residents get uniform and fair treatment, and in a very facts-based analysis of whether the URA applies, which is the short thumbnail of whether the URA applies is in situations of acquisition, rehab, or demo for federal or federally funded projects. It can apply on its own. So, for example, think about if there is an acquisition of a parcel next door to your public housing parcel that you're converting, and you're bringing that new piece of land into the picture. The URA would certainly apply to that situation. The URA can apply on its own right in the RAD context, and of course the RAD notice, the RAD relocation notice, is an effort by HUD to get into some of the details about how URA and RAD work together and how the URA requirements apply to the facts of more typical RAD cases. A key piece of the URA picture is to ensure that you're thinking carefully about the difference between temporary relocation and permanent relocation. And that's going to come up a number of times because that permanent relocation distinction is a little different under the URA than it is under the RAD terminology. So it's worth being very precise about whether something is temporary or permanent under the URA as distinguished from temporary or permanent in the RAD context. In the temporary context, under the URA, I sort of interpret that as ensuring that residents aren't worse off. But there are, of course, much more specific requirements than that. The temporary relocation requirements are, some of them are listed here, the General Information Notice, temporary housing, which is decent, safe, and sanitary, reimbursement of their out-of-pocket expenses, all part of the picture of making sure that the residents are no worse off as a result of this event that you as the RAD conversion sponsor is triggering in their lives. The requirements around temporary relocation are a little more limited in their descriptions in the URA. Part of that is because the URA is, the bulk of the URA is focused on permanent relocation scenarios, but the URA definitely does have guidance and requirements around temporary relocation. On the permanent relocation side, the URA goes into much greater detail about procedures and activities that are required in order to protect the residents of the site that's being impacted. The permanent requirements range from Again, this is a partial list, but some of the highlights: advisory services, notice to vacate, identification of alternative comparable housing options that meet the decent, safe, and sanitary requirements and are comparable to where the resident has currently been living, reimbursement of expenses, assistance. The assistance with added cost of housing is a little less likely to be true in a RAD conversion case because the RAD tenants are getting 30% of their income are paying 30% of their income for rent, and often in a RAD conversion, the housing authority is using mobile vouchers as a relocation strategy, in which case the rent may not actually change, but if it does, if there is any change, there is a 42-month requirement under the URA to make up that difference and protect the resident from that difference for 42 months in a permanent relocation context. The third statutory requirement that we're going to talk about is the CDBG and home funding requirements, which is, again, another overlay onto the RAD program, and it depends on whether you're getting CDBG and home dollars for your RAD conversion activities. Section 104D has some detail on the relocation itself. There is also in CDBG and home funded deals a one-for-one replacement housing requirement. For those of you who are intimate in the details of the RAD conversion and the RAD notice, you may recall that RAD does permit a de minimis reduction of 5% of the units, which is in tension with or is rather overruled by the CDBG and home one-for-one replacement requirement, which is a more stringent standard, and it's worth bearing that in mind. And the CDBG and home money also brings with it an analysis around economic displacement, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, may be less likely in the RAD conversion, particularly if you're using mobile vouchers as a relocation resource. But if the residents, it can still kick in the context of a public housing resident who is paying ceiling rent or something like that. So it's important to bear in mind that these CDBG and home funds come with this overlay of additional relocation analysis that needs to be done beyond what's in the RAD relocation notice and beyond the analysis about the URA. The HUD has various relocation specialists and resources that can help you think through a lot of these issues, but it's just trying to give you that overview of the RAD relocation notice, the URA notices as an overlay of that, and the CDBG and home funding as an overlay, and of course the fair housing and civil rights overlays that are all part of the analysis that you should be doing as you're beginning the process of thinking through your RAD transaction and your relocation features of your RAD transaction. So that is a very summary overview of kind of the landscape of requirements that are most likely to influence your RAD relocation strategy. Through the rest of the webinar, I'm going to be recurring. This slide will be a little bit recurring as I walk through the process of a RAD transaction and highlight some of the RAD moments and activities as they come up through a typical RAD transaction. Obviously, the red arrow is your RAD conversion, and below the red arrow are some key moments in the course of a RAD transaction. And the very first place that relocation thinking needs to get into your minds is before the RAD application. Now, some of you may be thinking that you already submitted your RAD application and didn't actually do any sort of notice at that point. That's forgivable to a point, because the notice that made this explicit came out in July of last year, indicating that initial notice to the residents was required before the RAD application. So if your RAD application went in before July of last year, now is a perfect time to correct the fact that that notice was not sent out. So the key first step is an initial notice and communication with the residents about the potential for relocation. In both the RAD and the Uniform Relocation Act context, this initial communication is called the General Information Notice. And RAD and the URA are, certainly RAD is very explicit that it needs to be provided as soon as feasible and before the application goes in. So it should be at the time of your resident meetings, and certainly some folks may need to scramble a little bit at this point to send the GIN out, but that should be the first step that you do following the webinar if you haven't sent out the GIN to the residents already. The core piece of the GIN is raising for the residents the possibility of relocation and assuring them that they have a variety of statutory protections and their procedures that you will be following. It's so that it alleviates some of the anxiety around the potential relocation. As a best practice, I would be recommending to the folks we work with to issue a general information notice, even if you think that there will not be relocation required, because as your project develops, you may find that you need to put people up in a hotel for a single night or something like that, and it's best to have the general information notice out there right at the beginning to assure people and to make them aware of the rights that they have, and to let them know that they don't need to do anything, that they will get more communication about any potential RAD requirements or any potential relocation requirements. The RAD relocation notice actually includes in Appendix 2 a sample of a general information notice. That's a sample only. It's drafted so that it fulfills all of the requirements of the Uniform Relocation Act description of a general information notice, which is in 49 CFR 24.203. But you certainly can tailor it to your needs if it doesn't really fit your situation. If you do tailor it, be careful to be thinking about what the actual requirements are that the statute and the regulations impose on the general information notice. So returning to our RAD conversion process, once the initial notice has happened and your RAD application has gone in, then you're starting to get into the planning of the relocation and in particular the planning of the right of return. The planning process is an iterative one, and it should spread over a period of time, both before your CHAP is issued, while you're beginning to frame your transaction, if you're getting low-income housing tax credits, before and after the award of the tax credits. It's an iterative process because the relocation requirements and the relocation thinking will influence or can influence the design of your transaction, particularly if there are issues around the right of return, and also the way the transaction is being designed, particularly around construction planning and that kind of thing, shapes what your relocation needs and your relocation plans need to be. So that as the RAD conversion transaction is forming into some shape, there needs to be a regular revisiting of what are the relocation plans and how do they fit into that transaction planning process. So as you're doing that planning process, the core piece of it is to minimize the impact of the relocation on the residents. So there are a lot of different ways your transaction could play out, which may or may not minimize that impact. You could be designing a construction phasing that means everybody is off-site for a very extended period of time, 12 or 18 months of a construction period, or you may be able to design it so that the contractor is moving through the buildings in a more sequential way, doing all of the work, let's say both the kitchens and the bathrooms simultaneously in a unit and getting the resident back into the unit very quickly. Similarly, you might be able to use vacant units and create a domino effect where you're renovating a vacant unit and then moving a household once from their current home into a new renovated home in connection with construction work that might be funded by the RAD conversion, in connection with the RAD conversion. So that thinking through of how do we minimize the impact on the residents, how do we keep the relocation period as short as possible, is part of your transaction design. And you also want to think about whether you can do all of your relocation on site. RAD specifically suspends your FAS scoring during the course of once you have received your CHAP as you're preparing for your RAD conversion event. And given that FAS scoring is suspended, you can start accumulating vacancies without having a penalty from HUD. And using those vacancies on turnover, you can build up a little pool of units that residents can move into on site in a way that reduces cost, reduces the disruption for the tenant, potentially reduces the fair housing, potential fair housing complications of off-site relocation. Using the relocation on-site is a recommended way of thinking about it, because you want to be minimizing these relocation issues and thinking about them in advance. The core issue about planning for relocation is that relocation issues are really hard to fix right before closing. The following the rules about relocation is something that you do need to be mindful of throughout the planning and build up to your RAD conversion transaction. Whether or not it has an extensive construction period or a very minor one, it's important to be thinking through those relocation requirements. It does come up that folks wonder about whether transfers to other public housing is a strategy that can be used in thinking through the transaction planning. That there's no prohibition on that, but it is a relocation, and you can't use the transfer policy as a way to get around the RAD relocation requirements, including the requirements around right of return and no permanent involuntary relocation. So be cautious about relying on your public housing transfer policies as your solution to relocation, unless you've really thought through your full relocation planning and compliance. Part of that thinking through is developing a full relocation plan. It's often surprising to folks that a written relocation plan is not required as often as many people think. That said, it's incredibly useful and, in my view, should be viewed as something that you must do. As a best practice, I strongly recommend writing up your relocation plans. It forces folks to think through all of the timelines, the implications, the process of the relocation, but it's not actually required all the time. It is important in thinking through your relocation plan and articulating it as a complete thing to be conscious of your construction timelines and integrate your construction planning and your relocation planning which may mean that this iterative relocation planning process leads right up to, a few months before your construction starts, as you may need to be in conversation with your contractor if you're doing an extensive in-unit upgrades. You may need to be in conversation with your contractor about what can be done in terms of the construction and how that relates to minimizing the impacts on the residents, both impacts that you can predict, and often it's helpful to talk to the residents and survey the residents about what their goals are and what their concerns and preferences might be as you're developing your relocation plan. The RAD relocation notice does provide in Appendix 1 some guidance in terms of what goes into a good comprehensive relocation plan. So that might be useful to you as you are preparing your relocation plan. And again, I strongly recommend that you write it up as a written relocation plan so that the decisions that you make are easily at people's fingertips throughout the process that you're implementing the RAD conversion and the resulting construction, if there is construction. So the resident right of return, a key piece to remember in that is that the residents can force the redesign of your RAD conversion if you do not have the resident right of return appropriately addressed. So that can happen if you are not planning carefully and you get to the day before closing and you discover that a resident wants to exercise the right of return and you have not addressed that situation and that your transaction design prevents it, that could kill your closing. So that's kind of what I mean, that RAD is, the relocation issues are ones that are very hard to solve at the last minute, much easier to plan for as you're starting to sketch out your transaction. A few examples that people have stumbled on in real RAD deals that have triggered the concern about right of relocation are listed on the screen. So if you're thinking about converting a family to an elderly community, think, for example, about how the right of return is exercised by the 40-year-old who happens to live there today. How is and of course this is an example of another fair housing context. How are the impacts on family status as a result of that decision? Is there a disparate impact on family status as a fair housing consideration in addition to a right of return consideration? Similarly, the bedroom distribution. For those of you with 4 and 5 bedroom units, or maybe even 6 bedroom units, I have heard of those, and you want to reconfigure them as part of your RAD conversion. Think about what that relocation right of return, that RAD right of return, and the fair housing issues, and the variety of issues that might affect that. You may be able to have residents who are overhoused move into smaller units, or multi-generational households split into 2 units, but that doesn't eliminate the question of whether there's someone who truly needs that unit, either a current resident who has a right of return or folks on the waiting list who might be disparately impacted by that decision to break up units, to reconfigure units. The third example is tax credits. Often RAD conversions are looking at an overlay of low-income housing tax credits, which has a 60% of AMI eligibility requirement. If you've got residents over that 60% of AMI threshold, you may need to remove them from your tax credit designated units, which may significantly impact how much equity you get in your tax credit transaction. You just need to think through what are the right of return requirements and do the residents want to exercise that right of return. Similarly, addressing accessibility. If you've got a resident who is right now not in a unit that deals with that addresses their accessibility, their current accessibility needs, you may need to address that, particularly in the context of new construction. And the fifth sort of example that most often trips folks up is transfer of assistance, and how does that play into the right of return. The transfer of assistance analysis actually triggers an interplay between both the RAD and the URA requirements. As I mentioned before, the two frameworks are a little different as to what is permanent relocation. And in the RAD context, the focus is on the resident's relationship to the rental subsidy. So if you are transferring assistance from, and let me rewind for a moment, that transfer of assistance, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a mechanism permitted under RAD where you could convert your public housing unit on Site A into a Section 8 unit, a RAD Section 8 unit on Site B, a different piece of property. And that moving the subsidized unit from one property to another is the transfer of assistance. In the RAD context, if the household moves with their subsidy from Site A to Site B, that is not a permanent relocation under RAD, but of course it is potentially a permanent relocation under the URA. The permanent relocation analysis is not just what a person on the street would think of as permanent. It really requires you to distinguish the RAD analysis where that may not be a permanent involuntary relocation from the URA where they are definitely moving from one property to another. But in the course of that move, it may not trigger URA requirements if the unit where the resident moved from is not subject to rehab or demolition or acquisition in connection with a federally funded project. So the RAD and the URA interaction in the transfer of assistance context is a particularly needs particularly careful thought to figure out which rules are applying to which households and how those rules apply. I think that we'll move on to the possibility for declining the right of return if they're acknowledging that the RAD requirements are very explicit, that there can be no permanent involuntary relocation, but a resident can decline that right of return and can voluntarily accept a permanent relocation option. Given that it is a hot topic for the RAD program, it's important that any resident who is declining that right of return that situation be handled quite carefully and sensitively. The resident needs to definitely have full information in order to be able to make an informed choice. They are required to have 30 days to make that choice. They cannot be pressured to make that choice. But it is an option for a resident to decline the right of return and choose to be permanently relocated. So in the RAD context, it is a prohibition on permanent involuntary relocation. And if the resident chooses a permanent relocation option, then you do need to be careful again about the temporary versus permanent relocation distinction and document it very carefully. The other piece about the URA and RAD interaction about permanent is that permanent relocation in the RAD context is not the same time frame as permanent relocation in the URA context. The URA defines as a permanent move anything that is over 12 months, whereas RAD does not make that distinction, and a RAD move that is a RAD temporary move could be of duration that's longer than 12 months, but again, that triggers a requirement to think through what the URA requires for a permanent relocation and what RAD requires for a not permanent relocation, and do that analysis carefully in terms of how the resident, what is being offered to the resident, and how the resident is being protected through the course of the relocation requirements. Once you have thought through all of your relocation planning issues, there is the need to integrate those plans with the public housing agency's general plans, the annual plan, or if necessary, an annual plan amendment, which should talk about the relocation issues, the long-term admissions and occupancy issues related to the RAD conversion, any impact on transfer policies, the reoccupancy of the property as the residents are returning, their ability to exercise the right of return, emphasizing again that you cannot rescreen residents. You cannot, the residents who are in the public housing property today must be able to exercise the ability to return to the site or remain on the site throughout. If you're not relocating folks in any extended way, you may not apply a new income screening or a new criminal background check or any of those kinds of screening. All of that is prohibited in connection with the residents who are living on site today. So it's, as you are developing your plans and articulating them, whether it's in a written relocation plan or whether it's in your agency plan, making sure that right of return and the rescreening protections are reflected should be a high priority in thinking through all of the relocation issues and planning. The final item, sort of through the planning process, is to think about the budgeting, and this list is by no means a comprehensive, detailed list. It's a list of things to trigger your thinking. I would also point out that the RAD Relocation Notice Appendix 1, which is the appendix that lists the potential contents of a good relocation plan, also lists some items that you may want to think about in terms of the budgeting. But some common issues for budgeting the relocation budget, and many of you are probably familiar with all of these, are things like the counseling and home search assistance, moving expenses, security deposits, utility setups, all of those items, but also any potential difference in the rent and utilities, whether it's during the time that someone is out of their unit on a temporary basis, or if it's permanent, there's a requirement under URA that assistance continue for 42 months. If you are bringing in CDBG or home funds, that time period for payments in connection with a rent differential extends to 60 months. The budget may also need to think about meals or transportation. That's particularly relevant if you are putting someone up in a hotel for a few nights and the hotel doesn't have a kitchen facility. You need to be thinking about their food. You need to be thinking about their transportation to and from school and work. The details of the budget are very tied to the resident experience and the situation and needs of your particular context, and they can be extremely variable depending on what your relocation plans are. So budgeting for relocation can have a very small number or a very substantial number, which certainly also affects the viability of your RAD transaction budgets as a whole. as you're thinking through this iterative process of planning for your transaction and planning for your relocation. I'd point out that the URA materials, the regulations and guidebooks that HUD offers on the URA has a whole lot more information about budgeting and how to calculate things like moving expenses and that what can be offered in connection with the relocation payments and assistance. And so it's worth checking back in with that guidance and with those regulations to ensure that when you're budgeting, you've really got a pretty comprehensive list of what needs to be paid for, because certainly this overview is not that comprehensive a list, and I would refer you back to the URA. So I'm going to pause and turn the microphone over to Virginia, who's going to offer us a little bit of a, I think it's Virginia, who's going to offer us a little bit of a case study to try to illustrate some of the principles that I've been talking about.
Hi, so we wanted to provide a case study to kind of hit on some of the points that Tom has already covered. So the first case study, the PHA is planning to rehab a 100-unit project using home funds. The project will have 95 units after rehab to make room for a community center on site. The construction and temporary relocation is estimated to be about 12 months. And Claude's going to help me tag team this case study presentation. So, Claude.
Yes. Residents are not able to remain in their units, but they can stay on the property. And the PHA has been leaving units vacant in anticipation of their rehab. The PHA has surveyed residents about whether they want to remain in the project or be permanently relocated. Some tenants have indicated that after rehab they want to return to their original units.
So once the units have been renovated, the PHA is planning on looking at the tenant's payment and lease violation history and reviewing that before allowing them to move back into the renovated units. Tenants with poor payment records and or more than 3 lease violations will be given an HCV so they can move to another location and will not be allowed to come back to the property. So for the first case study, these are the summary of issues that we identified based on the narrative that Claude and I just provided. And so for the first, they're going to be using home funds. So Brian O'Neill from the CPD office will give us a little bit more on that use of home funds and what that triggers.
Thanks, Virginia. And I just want to make a general comment here. Tom had mentioned earlier when you're using CDBG and home funding, you just need to be aware that something, the Section 104D relocation and the one-for-one replacement housing requirements may apply. Okay, just because you have CDBG or home funding in your project doesn't mean that they're automatically triggered and applied to that undertaking. And again, as Tom had mentioned, URA is very fact-specific for making inquiries, and Section 104D is even more complex. So just be aware, flag it, CDBG and home funds. It may trigger 104D, but we really need to get a lot more detail on those. In the case study, it's not clear whether or not they would actually apply. Conceivably, it may apply, but through the what would be the conversion of lower-income dwelling units to something other than lower-income housing. But without getting too deep in it, just remember the takeaway: CDBG and home doesn't automatically mean it's triggered. 104D is triggered, but it may apply, and we need to get more details. Thanks. Yeah, so it would be something to flag for your TM, and your TM could get in touch with the right people here at HUD that could help us dig into that and see what the requirements are. And so another key point of this case study was the different definitions of permanent displacement. Tom touched on it a few slides ago, that URA and RAD have different definitions of what permanent displacement are. For URA, if it's a relocation that lasts 12 months or more. And for RAD, there is no time requirement. We don't think about it in terms of time. We just think about it in terms of
If the resident is not going to be coming back to the project, then we would consider that resident permanently displaced. Claude?
Yes. And in the case study, we have it, the relocation being at 12 months, which means you're on that edge between temporary relocation and permanent relocation under the URA, with different notice requirements and different benefits that would have to be accorded to the tenants. So when you see a relocation that's getting close to that 12-month time period, you have to be very careful and very cognizant of what happens if you go over 12 months. Your tenants are permanently displaced for purposes of URA, and a whole different set of requirements come into play. The next point is that under RAD, you have a right to return to the project, not to your specific unit. So as long as a decent, safe, and sanitary unit that's appropriate for your family size is available in the project, the RAD requirement for the right of return has been met.
And the last point here is that we mentioned that the PHA was going to be looking into the lease violation and payment history of the tenants when moving them back to the property once it was completely renovated. And that would not be allowed under RAD because the RAD rules prohibit any restraining. So at conversion, the PHA shouldn't be looking at those things. It should be taking care, if there's violations in the past, that the PHA should be following its own occupancy policies and dealing with residents that way. But the conversion itself should not be an opportunity to be looking at these things. So that was the first case study. Tom?
Thank you. So we've now finished up the planning process back to this timeline that is familiar or becoming familiar to you. And the next sort of moment in the process is the financing plan. The financing plan submission to HUD is when you as the sponsor of this RAD conversion, whether you're a housing authority or a developer partner or whomever, you're presenting to HUD the whole picture of the deal sketched out. And part of that whole picture of the deal is the relocation picture. And so part of that presentation of the whole picture is the relocation plan, which can be described in the financing plan, although many people who take the best practice advice of having a written relocation plan that sketches out all of the issues and is a mechanism to think through the process. Some people choose to attach the entire written relocation plan to their financing plan milestone. That is not required, but it certainly is an option. But this moment around the financing plan is when the whole picture is being presented to HUD for analysis and review. It's as the RAD notice indicates, the financing plan is at the 180-day milestone. It includes the budget for the transaction as a whole. Relocation costs do need to be part of it. It also includes an FHEO accessibility and relocation checklist, which has several questions that HUD asks each deal sponsor to answer. And you can include the full relocation plan as an attachment. One thing to bear in mind in connection with this review by HUD is that the FHEO accessibility and relocation checklist is really designed by HUD to catch red flags. It is not a determination by HUD that all of your plans are in compliance with RAD's relocation notice, with the URA, with Section 104D, if that's applicable, with fair housing. HUD is not asserting that you are in compliance. They are trying to generate information that could raise red flags and trigger further questions. And I think that it's important as you submit your financing plan to either provide enough detail or expect follow-up questions if your relocation is a little more complex. So if it's a complicated phasing, or if you are involving transfer assistance, or doing any of the things that might trigger right of return concerns, you do want to have a little more detail and explain that, and certainly be prepared for HUD to come back with questions to try to figure out whether there is something there that they should be nervous about as they work through the review of the process. So the relocation plan is described in the course of the financing plan submission, and then we get back to the life of your RAD project, and HUD is doing their analysis and leading up to HUD's issuance of the RAD conversion commitment, which is the indication that HUD has reviewed the financing plan and is generally comfortable with the financing plan, perhaps with conditions. And that moment of the RAD conversion commitment, leading up to that moment, everything that you have done in connection with relocation is either information gathering or is planning. Up until the RAD conversion commitment is issued, a housing authority and anybody on the housing authority's team, whether the housing authority is doing it on its own or with a developer partner or with consultants, no one should be actually implementing any of the relocation activities before the RAD conversion commitment is issued. Everything up to now is information gathering and planning and communication. Issuance of the RAD conversion commitment is the trigger for starting to issue additional relocation notices, but it is still not the moment to start actually relocating households. Not the moment to start actually moving. When the RAD conversion commitment is issued, there is a requirement that a RAD notice be sent to the residents. It's called the RAD Notice of Relocation. Just in case people are tracking how my language is, I'm trying to use RAD Relocation Notice to refer to the PIH and H notice with all the guidance in it, and the RAD Notice of Relocation is the letter to the residents that is an official notice under the requirements. So the issuance of the RCC is the moment when the housing sponsor, the public housing conversion sponsor, should issue the RAD Notice of Relocation. It should happen as soon as possible after the RCC is issued, and it's the notice to the resident that communicates that eligibility for relocation is real. It sets the eligibility in the Uniform Relocation Act terms. It's considered the initiation of negotiations. It is the moment where you are starting to tell the resident that relocation will happen and what their responsibilities are in order to help find a new place, or if they're getting temporarily relocated, prepare for moves or whatever. There will be subsequent notices about the exact timing of the move, but the notice of relocation needs to be issued as soon after the RCC as possible. And if you don't have all of the information about when the move is going to happen, you definitely will need to follow that up with more detail, but you should still issue the notice of relocation when the RCC comes out, because it's the fixing of eligibility for the relocation assistance and payments. So what's in the RAD Notice of Relocation? HUD has conveniently offered in the RAD Relocation Notice two more appendices, Appendix 3 and Appendix 4, which provide templates that you can use. Those templates are drafted as if the Notice of Relocation discussion of eligibility and the instruction to start planning for the move is all happening at the same time. That may not fit exactly your situation, So like the other template notices, it is something that you can tailor to your situation, as long as your tailoring is sensitive to the RAD relocation notice requirements and the Uniform Relocation Act requirements and any other requirements that may be applicable under Section 104D, for example, or whatever. If it is combined, the RAD Notice of Relocation talks about the eligibility. It includes a description of the payments or relocation assistance that the resident is entitled to. It will have the notice before the move, so a minimum of 30 days notice before a temporary move and 90 days notice before a permanent move. And you may need to supplement that if you are giving them a lot of notice. You may need to supplement it with a notice closer to the date of an actual move to keep the residents informed and guide the residents through the process. It's worth noting that a HUD notice of non-displacement is not required, but it is worth thinking about what communication you have already sent to the residents if they are not actually going to be subject to any relocation. If you sent them the GIN previously, it may be worth a courtesy notice to them. If you sent them the GIN and they're getting a notice of relocation about temporary relocation, you're communicating what their plans are or how they should be making plans around what you're doing. And the core here is you're wanting to communicate with the residents in a way that both addresses their concerns and also addresses the requirements of the RAD notice, the RAD relocation notice, and the Uniform Relocation Act and any other applicable requirements. So the RAD notice of relocation in Appendix 3 and 4 is a good reference point for how to do these notices. On the temporary side, you'll be giving the folks the core information in a temporary notice is that they're eligible for assistance, that they're getting a move date, and that they know where their destination unit is. So that's sort of the core of the temporary notice of relocation. There are other requirements, but that's the core of it. 30 days notice is the minimum requirement. You should think through whether longer notice is appropriate, either because they're going to move for an extended period of time or because their circumstances would require them to make more arrangements in connection with a temporary move. But the core requirements are the eligibility, the move date, and the destination unit, which destination unit needs to be decent, safe, and sanitary, consistent with HUD's requirements on the nature of the unit. On the permanent side, the RAD notice of relocation has a minimum of 90 days notice, so that's specifying the earliest date to move. And the other core piece of information is providing information on comparable replacement dwelling units. Units that the household could say, okay, I want the second one on your list, and I'm going to move into that unit. There is a minimum that one comparable replacement unit needs to be offered, but if possible, you need to be providing 3 comparable replacement units. And again, the best practices are on communication and teeing in the permanent context, you need to be teeing the resident up for participating in the assistance so that they can get guidance in planning their move and in choosing the unit they move to. They do not need to go to one of the 3 units that you have identified as comparable. They can choose their own. But one of the challenges of this notice of relocation and the 90 days notice is that you need to be clear with the residents that they still can't actually move. So that can be a little complicated if you're encouraging the residents to start thinking about a move 90 days from now, but if they go and find a unit, you're not allowed to, they can't start the relocation move at this point in the process. So you need to be very careful in your communications and give time for them to find units and select a unit and be able to move to a unit consistent with the requirement that you're still not allowed to implement relocation at this point in the process. The URA, at the same time as the RAD notice of relocation, you need to be thinking about the URA notice of relocation eligibility. This is also, there's a sample in the RAD relocation notice at Appendix 5. And this is a notice that is required for anybody that you know today will be out of their unit for 12 months, for over 12 months. So even if under the RAD context it's a temporary move, they plan to return to the site, but they will be out of their unit for over 12 months, they need to get the notice of relocation eligibility consistent with the URA requirement, in addition to the notice of relocation under RAD. You may be able to merge the documents. I haven't actually talked with HUD about whether these need to be separate documents or can be merged, but it's important to distinguish that if they're going to be out of their unit for over 12 months, you need to satisfy the URA notice of relocation eligibility requirement and all of the details that the URA regulations at 49 CFR Part 24 have about that notice of relocation eligibility. Because that over 12-month period triggers in the URA framework the permanent relocation requirement. So the takeaway of these notices is that there are two separate requirements, the RAD requirement and the URA requirement. You need to do the analysis of whether the URA requirement kicks in for an over 12-month relocation. You need to send out the notices right after the RCC is issued that satisfies the RAD and the URA notice of relocation eligibility rules, and think through how that interplays with when your residents would actually be moving, and what kind of support and assistance and guidance you need to provide to them in planning that move, whether the move is a temporary one where you are identifying the unit that they're going to go into, or whether the move is a permanent one that they have chosen, a permanent one under URA, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, and a permanent one under RAD that they have chosen voluntarily, in which case you are giving them some options of units that they move into, but they also have the ability to go out and find their own unit. So that's the moment of the the RAD conversion commitment issuance, but still not yet the moment that you can have folks actually moving. And I'm going to turn it back to HUD for case study number 2.
Thanks, Tom. So this case study, again, builds on the same example we had in case study 1, where the PHA is planning to rehab a 100-unit project using home funds. After the rehab, they're planning on having 95 units and still have the same plans for the community center. So they're a little bit further along here, and they've completed their RAD physical conditions assessment, their RPCA, and now they're thinking that their construction and temporary relocation will be 14 months, so up from the previous estimate of 12 months. The PHA is still planning to accommodate all of the relocation on site, but it wants to start moving those residents into the vacant units this month.
PHA has surveyed residents again on their desire to return to the site or move permanently, and many residents now want to move permanently off-site using housing choice vouchers. The PHA is scheduled to receive their RCC in a month and expects to close in 2 months.
So the takeaways for this case study is a little bit more about what Claude spoke on the first time we covered this. So instead of being a planned temporary relocation of 12 months, it's now going to exceed the 12-month mark, and it's going to kick in a lot of those URA requirements. So at the outset here, the PHA has to offer the resident a choice between temporary relocation for the full 14 months with retaining their right to return to the project once it's completed, or the residents can decline their right to return and receive permanent relocation assistance and payments at URA levels at the outset.
And now that relocation has it's become more than 12 months, the PHA would issue a URA, not RAD, notice of relocation eligibility. Brian?
Yeah, and what I'd like to do is just clarify the second point. When a PHA should issue a URA, notice of relocation eligibility, that should really be accomplished when a person's actual temporary relocation exceeds 12 months. So in the first bullet, we talked about issuing these other RAD relocation notices. So, you know, where I guess a person's temporary relocation is anticipated to exceed 12 months, as Virginia said, they're provided the option to either be temporarily relocated for that length of time or to accept voluntary permanent relocation at URA levels in accordance with RAD. So for the folks that accepted temporary relocation and now they're off-site or they're in temporary relocation status for more than 12 months, at that point in time, the PHA needs to issue them a URA notice of relocation eligibility for permanent relocation assistance. Does that mean that the person needs to accept that? No, it doesn't. The person can accept that permanent relocation assistance under URA and, again, decline their right to return, or based on new information of how long the construction is going to take when they come back to the project, they can actually remain in temporary relocation status for a longer period of time. So yeah. I hope that helps clarify. Yeah. It gets to be very confusing, I think, for us even at times.
So to clarify and summarize that a little bit, so the first bullet was about what the PHA has to do at the beginning, before they've moved anybody. These are the choices that need to be offered before moving anybody and before the relocation actually begins. And the second bullet is what the PHA has to do at the point where that temporary relocation becomes 12 months or more. And so, Claude, do you want to wrap up the last slide, the last point there?
Yes. The last point is that after the issuance of RCC, you can issue notices, but you cannot move tenants prior to closing. So the notices can go out, whether it's temporary or permanent relocation. They can go out once the RCC has been issued, but the actual physical moving of tenants cannot take place until after closing. Now, tenants can choose to move, say, earlier than 90 days if it's a permanent move, but it still cannot take place prior to closing. Tom?
Great, thanks. So the notices themselves, there are some requirements and also some recommendations about the notices themselves that we wanted to highlight. I'm not going to read all of these requirements, but be aware that there is, in addition to these sort of high points, there's additional detail about the notices in the CFR listed on the bottom bullet. One place that folks do get tripped up is the fourth bullet. Once they've got a notice in writing and it's being delivered, and the distinction between personally served and sent by certified or registered mail with return receipt is not necessarily the same as hand delivery to the unit. And the question that the scenario that you need to be concerned about is if your property manager is taking the notices around unit by unit, ringing the doorbell, and the 20-year-old son of the head of household answers the door and takes the notice, that's a risky solution. And so the requirement is that the notice be personally served or sent by certified or registered mail with return receipt. But in a best practice and a practical way, you really do need to be making sure that the head of household is the one who is actually getting the notice. Some of the other sort of recommendations are, as a best practice, you really should be getting a receipt for each relocation notice. It confirms, particularly in a case where an informed decision-making is required, it helps confirm that the information was given to that household. So if I were looking at a situation where someone is declining the right to return, I would want to be absolutely sure that the head of household has acknowledged that they received information making clear what their options were, that they were not being pressured into a particular choice, so that there is a documentation of an informed decision as they decline a right if they decide to decline a right to return. The content of the notices is also a frequent hazard place for housing for folks who are implementing RAD transactions. Examples of problematic content are things like telling the resident that they have options, but not really describing the cost impacts on the resident in terms of their rent or anything else of those options, or failing to identify the destination unit in a temporary relocation notice. The sum total of the notices, you may not have that destination unit at the moment that you issue the RAD notice of relocation, where you're telling them that they are eligible for this assistance, but then you need to subsequently supplement that notice with the notice that includes the rest of the information that's required, whether it's now we have a date that you need to move and you've got 30 days notice before that date, or what your destination unit is, examples like that. It's important that the content meet all of the requirements of the URA, of the RAD relocation notice, and that these are places that housing authorities and their development partners have stumbled, and it's worth a little extra attention to make sure that the documentation is complete, it's well documented, and it's thorough in terms of covering what's required. It's also worth noting that if your plans change, that may not trigger you to remember that you now need to update your notices. Changing transaction plans do require you to update the notices if the change in the transaction plan impacts what was said in the notices with respect to required information about the relocation. So do keep in mind the relocation as the details change through the course of the life of the project. So back to this familiar slide, we're now at closing, and now, finally, you've been building up to it, you can start moving folks. Now, but only at closing, except in some very rare exceptions. So the RAD relocation notice was very specific that relocation, the moves, begins only after closing. The concern, I assume, is that what happens if the RAD deal never closed, and now these residents have been displaced temporarily, they've been inconvenienced. The RAD relocation notice is very explicit that the actual moves can only begin after closing and after the conversion has taken place. There is an exception allowing for early relocation, but certainly what I have told the folks that we are working with on RAD transactions is that it's not worth pursuing that exception. And I say that for a couple reasons. One is because the HUD has set the bar very high as to what qualifies for warranting that exception. But also, even in that exception, that would only allow you to begin moves at the time of the RCC, and usually, in my experience at least, when you get the RCC, folks are starting to move quickly to closing, And so getting that exception would really only start the moves a very few number of weeks in advance of when your closing would happen anyway. So it really, in my mind, is not something that you should think about as a first. Your mind should not go first to asking for the exception to the timing of the moves. It does exist, but it's very rare, and you should be talking to HUD folks if you think that your situation might clear the bar to warrant that exception. But in the vast, vast majority of cases, relocation needs to begin after closing of the RAD conversion. And then, of course, after all of the notice periods, the 30 or 90-day notice periods have run their course. So the other piece of implementation is obviously the money. The RAD program is designed fundamentally so that there is money available to pay for relocation, for housing in the relocation unit. There is what's called a rehab assistance payment, which is the equivalent of the subsidy that the housing authority has been getting for the unit. Of course, the tenant is continuing to pay the tenant-paid portion based on their income. But it is worth noting that if the temporary relocation unit costs more than the combination of the RAD rehab assistance payment and the tenant-paid portion, your budget for the RAD conversion transaction does need to cover that difference in cost. So the program is designed to have money flowing so that you're able to pay for, that you're able to rent the unit on behalf of the tenant and then collect from the tenant paid portion. But you do need to budget if the numbers are not going to balance out exactly right. There is a nice little bonus if you actually are relocating folks into existing public housing, whether it's a unit on site or in a different public housing property. You can actually collect the subsidy on the unit that's being occupied and on the rehab assistance payment for the unit they vacated, which I suppose is a way to reiterate in practice that on-site relocation is actually often your best bet. And finally, the last time that you are going to see this slide, we're at the end of the deal. You have done whatever construction is planned for in connection with the RAD conversion, and you are moving the residents back into the unit, and the residents are exercising their right of return. You may be moving them into a different specific apartment on the property, but you are moving them back to the property, to the RAD site and to an assisted unit under the RAD contract. The right of return is a property specific right of return, not a unit specific right of return. And at this point, the issues often surround the issues of record keeping, because you need to have an auditable record after the fact in case any questions come up. So this is something that you would be building throughout the relocation process. I've identified some of the core issues in the record of relocation: the identity of all the residents, the units that they moved from and to, copies of the notices, and you really should have copies of each notice to the resident acknowledged by the resident. That's as a best practice. If you have given them options and choices, document their decisions, document the numbers of any relocation payments, reasonable accommodations. There are a number of other things that are listed in the CFR, the 49 CFR 24.9, which is the Uniform Relocation Act regulations. There's also a URA handbook, Handbook 1378, that covers these and a lot of other issues. But you should, in thinking about your record keeping and what files you are building throughout your relocation process, you should refer back to the detailed guidance to make sure that you're getting all of the pieces. Since a webinar can only go so far before completely boring you to death, we are just covering the overview, and you do need to reference the guidebooks and the regulations themselves. You also need to have in place an appeals process. The URA provides for a right of appeal, and 49 CFR 24.10 describes that a little more. So if you do not have an appeal process already established, you would need to set that up in connection with your RAD relocation planning. So throughout the webinar, I've been referencing quite a number of different documents, and these are some of the key ones. Obviously, the RAD relocation notice, which is on the RAD resource website. There is, to amplify on some of the issues there is an FAQ that the RAD program has running. Certainly, any questions that come up after today, you should be encouraged to submit to the FAQ and get that on there for future folks, because I'm sure your questions you're not the only one having those questions. The URA regulations themselves at 49 CFR Part 24. There is HUD has relocation guidance in the HUD Handbook 1378. There's a particularly good resource at the HUD relocation website, or that's how I refer to it. It's actually relocation and acquisition. It is covered. It's hud.gov/relocation. The relocation and acquisition website has copies of virtually all, if not all, of the resources on this list. Perhaps not the FAQ, but certainly most of the others. May not have the PowerPoints in the FAQ, but it certainly has the regulations, the handbooks, notice templates. It has a lot of good reference material on the HUD relocation and acquisition website, www.hud.gov/relocation. And the RAD PowerPoints, obviously, on the RAD resource desk, and the Section 104D requirements at 24 CFR Part 42. So these are places to go to for more information, in addition to the talking to your transaction manager, talking to HUD's relocation specialists. But there's a lot of good material on these websites. So at this point, I'm going to start doing a little bit of a summary, because I've thrown an awful lot of material at you. There is a RAD relocation checklist. This is the checklist that the transaction manager is filling out in connection with their review of the financing plan and their presentation of your deal to the HUD RAD Transaction Review Committee. And so, certainly in my mind, if I know what is being asked of my transaction manager, I want to make sure that I am answering all of those questions clearly for my transaction manager. So the RAD relocation checklist asks, will there be relocation? Is there a written plan? Will any relocation last more than 12 months? Is there a choice being presented between permanent relocation and right of return? Are there particular risks related to the right of return? Is there a transfer of assistance? Is there any request to start relocation early? Has anyone already been relocated? Have we identified the destination units, thinking about the budget, and are the notices adequate? These are the kinds of things that your transaction manager is getting asked about, and are also serve as red flags for potential issues that may need more discussion. So just to sort of illustrate, this is the actual relocation checklist. I don't have any pretense that you can actually read it on your screen right now, but it will be available on the RAD resource desk, and you may want to get familiar with it. It is but it is fundamentally asking the questions that I listed on the previous page. So just know what your transaction manager needs to be able to be presenting your deal to others at HUD is a good place to start in terms of thinking about your relocation. And now for the final case study and then a few wrap-up slides, and we are nearing the end. So back to HUD for the third case study.
Thank you, Tom. This case study is a little bit different. It's not really, I don't think, building on the prior two. The PHA's plans to demolish 2 buildings, each with 70 family units, and replace them with 2 buildings, each containing 60 units of elderly housing. The PHA plans to demolish the existing buildings and construct the new buildings in 2 phases. In phase 1, 1 building will be demolished and a new building will be constructed. In phase 2, the second building will be demolished and a second building will be constructed. Construction of each phase is projected to take 10 months. Virginia?
The PHA has already sent the GINs and the RAD relocation notices to the tenants and has let them know that they have to move. In preparation for the construction, the PHA has already moved 50 residents from both buildings permanently. The PHA has yet to receive its RTC, but it expects it next month and expects to close in approximately 2 months.
So here are the summary of issues that this case study raises. As Tom has emphasized at various points in the presentation, when you change from family to elderly or you change the type of occupancy, you automatically have to think about who might be permanently displaced as a result of that. When you're going from family to elderly, there's a very high likelihood that there are families that will not be able to be accommodated by a change to elderly. There's also a FHEO concern here because sometimes the family that's impacted may be disproportionately part of one ethnic group.
Another issue that this case study presents is that the unit reduction proposed by the Housing Authority exceeds the allowable de minimis threshold. And then I'll turn it over to Brian here to talk about the home and Section 104D potential issues.
And this is very much a potential issue because I think what was an oversight, that this case study was actually supposed to include home funding in the new construction, and I don't see that's the case here. So with the example that we were trying to make for this case study, where you have home funding in the project and there was demolition of existing public housing units that would, for purposes of 104D, equate to lower income dwelling units, we were trying to make clear that it looked to us as though Section 104D would be triggered for this case study. So just because home's in the picture doesn't mean that it always is triggered. In this case, it should have been triggered had the home funding been present in the case study, if that makes any sense to anyone. So the Section 104D relocation and the one-for-one replacement housing requirements should apply to this case study example and to this RAD conversion project. And the other thing that we discussed, had home been involved in this project, assuming that it is, another consideration for home and CDBG is something called economic displacement protections for those. And that's not to be confused with Section 104D requirements. That's a specific program regulatory requirement. And essentially that's to prevent when home or CDBG is used in a project that as a result of using that funding in the project that the rents are increased, making them unaffordable to the existing residents. So, that if home's in there, if CDBG is in there, potentially economic displacement could be a factor, but as Tom mentioned previously, that's not always the case.
Thanks, Brian. And another issue here was the timing of the notices that were sent to the residents. As we said, the PHA has not yet received its RCC, but it's already sent the RAD relocation notices to residents. So if it was following the RAD rules, it would have to wait until it received its RCC, and then it would be able to send out the RAD relocation notices. And
on the final 2 points, they've committed the cardinal sin under RAD by relocating residents prior to closing, which is something you absolutely, positively do not want to do. And if you take nothing away from this training, it should be that residents are not to be relocated prior to closing, and certainly not without prior consultation and approval by HUD under any circumstances. This case study is actually based on an actual situation we found, and I'm going to just expand upon it to show you how you can inadvertently trip requirements. In the actual case, the project was being done in 2 phases, and the PHA got RCC approval for phase 1, moved their tenants after closing. The problem was that the project was being done in 2 phases, and when they moved the tenants for phase 1, they also moved the tenants for phase 2, and the construction for phase 2 wasn't going to begin for something like 10 months after the first phase. Well, the clock starts ticking the minute you relocate the tenants. So now you have some tenants who were temporarily relocated, but other tenants who were moved and will not be moving back to the project until phase 2 is completed will be relocated for longer than 12 months. So on top of having moved people prior to closing, they also have people who are permanently relocated. So you have 2 problems there. So you have to be very careful about only moving the people that you have approval to move, i.e., if you're in a multi-phase, and phase 1 is the one that's got approval and a closing, you can move the tenants in that phase after closing, but that does not mean you can move other tenants even if they're part of a later phase. Tom?
Great, thank you. So I'm going to reiterate, because as you may have noticed already, there are a few things that HUD very much wants you not to go away having any doubt about. The first is that the residents hold a right of return, and that they can force a redesign of your transaction right up to the closing date if you have not thoroughly thought through how that right of return is exercised, unless they decline it in a fully informed way. And related to the right of return is that there is no rescreening allowed for the residents before their return. The second major point, which is the one Claude was just reiterating, is don't move residents prior to closing. I would encourage you not to pay attention to the limited exception. It does exist, but it is so limited, I would discourage you from focusing on it too much. And the third is the requirement of no permanent involuntary relocation. So those are core RAD takeaways. And then in terms of the relocation itself, this is a summary, certainly not a complete list, but in the temporary context, there's the decent, safe, and sanitary temporary housing requirement, the 30 days notice to the move, and the reimbursement of moving costs and other expenses are sort of the core elements of the relocation assistance in the temporary context. And in the permanent context, the core elements of relocation assistance and payments are the requirement to offer between 1 and 3 comparable units. 1 is the minimum, 3 is if possible, as well as advisory services in helping the resident choose their own, choose where they want to move to. 90 days notice before the move, again, reimbursement of moving costs and related expenses, and payment of the rent differential if that's necessary, which may be less likely in a RAD conversion case, but it's definitely worth thinking about, particularly in cases of things like ceiling rent and that kind of thing. So that's the summary of the core assistance that would be offered. And as a final sort of wrapping up comment, I wanted to list a few takeaways that I hope that this webinar has helped you absorb. The first is the distinction and the importance of the distinction between temporary and permanent, and the importance in thinking through that distinction, also applying the difference in how RAD and the URA identify permanent, and tracking those carefully with respect to every resident and every move, and with respect to the 12-month standard and the whether the RAD unit is moving in the transfer of assistance case and stuff like that. So the temporary and permanent difference is a key part of your analysis. The second key part of your analysis is the making sure that these core forms of assistance and payment is provided to the residents, but also remembering that the regulations are absolutely critical, and this webinar is by no means a replacement for digging into the requirements of the statute, the regulations, and the HUD guidance on how to implement an appropriate relocation. The third piece is that it is very fact-based. Very small details can change what the requirements are under the various relocation regulations and guidance. And so you need to be looking at the facts, and as the facts that you're planning evolve, you need to be revisiting your relocation plans to make sure that they continue to be consistent with the facts of your transaction and your plans, whether they involve extensive or very minor construction. The RAD conversion plans the evolution of those plans may change what the relocation requirements are in each particular instance. The fourth takeaway is, again, that planning and communication is critically important throughout the RAD process. Planning for the relocation and communicating with the residents so that they understand the plans and their impact. The fifth takeaway I would emphasize is the right of return. That has to be there can be no pressure to decline the right of return, and there can be no permanent involuntary relocation. The resident needs to be able to exercise the right of return. Sixth takeaway, no moves before closing. And finally, the seventh and sort of underlying all of this takeaway is that the Uniform Relocation Act and the RAD relocation notice and all of the rest of the guidance and regulations that we're talking about is really geared towards ensuring that the residents are treated fairly and that they are housed in decent, safe, and sanitary housing throughout the time period that you're looking at. So I know that this has been a lot of information presented very quickly to you. I hope that it provides you a little bit of an overview of the relocation requirements associated with a RAD conversion. And HUD has been very clear that questions or feedback or suggestions for additional training, HUD welcomes those going to rad@hud.gov. Rad@hud.gov is an email address that HUD monitors regularly and responds to. Often the questions that come into rad@hud.gov are posted on the FAQ, so it's a good go-to. And then, of course, the HUD resources, the hud.gov/rad and also hud.gov/relocation have a lot of additional detail and information. So thank you for your attention. I really appreciate your being on the line, and I turn it back to Claude for any final comments.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think you've really presented a great overview of the relocation issues. We appreciate everyone taking the time from their day to attend this webinar, and we look forward to working with many of you in the future as you work through your RAD transactions and related relocation issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes today's training. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.